Hello everyone, and welcome to my second video. Today, I want to show you what you can do as a developer to make the UI as clean and simple as possible for your users when they import their data to Flatfile. Now, if you've done a single import, you know that after the user imports their file, the first step is for them to map the fields that they imported from the file to the fields that you've defined in your sheet. Now that can get problematic if you have 50, 60, or even 100 fields defined, but a user imports a file that only contains 5 or 7 fields. Even if they map 5 or 7 fields, when the Flatfile table loads, they will see all the fields that you've defined in your sheet. And that is what I want to show you today, is what you can do as a developer to only show the users the fields that they mapped when the Flatfile table loads. First, we'll take a look at the user workflow to see how exactly it looks like. And after that, we'll dive into the code so I can show you what am I doing so that you can update the table to only show the users the fields they mapped. After that, when they click the submit button to send the data to your database, I'll confirm with you that you will only receive the information about the mapped fields. And at the end of the video, I prepared a little bit of a bonus content for you to show what you can do to protect your database against receiving duplicate information if a user by accident clicks on the submit button twice. So without further ado, let's get started. So before we dive into the code, let's take a look at the general user workflow. Over here you see that I have a sheet with 5 fields defined: first name, last name, full name, email, and country of birth columns. Once I import a file, I'll make sure that I do not map the full name and country of birth fields, as you can see over here. Now, by default, even though I do not map these fields, when the Flatfile table loads, it will show me all the fields that are defined in the sheet. However, I'll make sure that when a user clicks this continue button here, the table updates to only present the mapped fields. Once that update is complete, the users receive a success message that they're ready to audit the data, and once they do, they can click this submit button to send the data to your database. When I click this submit button, the data is sent to my sample database, which in this case is a webhook site URL, and we can indeed see that I've only received the data about the mapped fields. So first name, last name, and email fields. And then, as I promised you, for the bonus content, let's say a user by accident clicks the submit button twice. Even though the submit job completes, when I go and check my sample database again, you will see that on the second submit, I received no data. That way, if a user makes that mistake by accident, I protect my database to only receive the data once. So now that we know how the user workflow looks like, let's take a look at the code. And keep in mind that this code and the example files that I'm using are available to you in the public GitHub repository that I will link to the description of this video. What I will also link to is documentation to any Flatfile specific terminology that I'm using throughout this video. So inside of this code, first thing I'm doing is importing all the necessary packages to make sure that the code runs, and then I'm defining a unique URL where the data will be sent once the users click the submit button. So the main action is happening inside of this Flatfile event listener function. The first thing I'm doing is to make sure that all the code below only runs on an app that contains app1 namespace. To make sure that this namespace over here matches to the app to which you want this code to apply, in your Flatfile dashboard, you can click on this Edit App button to ensure that the namespace here matches to the namespace defined in your code. So inside of the Flatfile event listener function, I have 4 main listeners. The first listener executes when a user either clicks on this button here to create a new space, or if you embed Flatfile into your app, it will execute once the user clicks on the import button. Once they do, a space will be created and a workbook, 2 sheets, and a submit action will be attached to that space. That is what this first listener is responsible for. After that, when a user imports a file and determines which columns they want to map, and in our case, where we'll leave full name and country of birth columns unmapped, they can click on the Continue button. When they do so, that second listener executes, and all it does is creates a custom job. The reason why I'm creating a custom job is to show the user a confirmation pop-up that the table has been updated and they're ready to audit the data. But all that logic of updating the table is carried out in this third listener. So as I click the Continue button, the custom job is created and executes. And once the table is updated, they receive this confirmation pop-up that they're now ready to work with the data. Once they understand that they're ready to submit the data, when they click on this Submit button, the last listener will execute. This listener is responsible for two things. The first thing it does is it sends all the data to your database, and we ensure that the data you receive is indeed only for the mapped fields. And then the second thing it is responsible for is if a user by accident clicks on the Submit button twice, the code inside of that last listener ensures that you only receive the data once. So if a user clicks the button multiple times on accident, your database is protected and you only receive the data once. So now that we understand the general structure of the code, let's analyze the code inside of each listener so you can see what am I doing to make this use case possible. The first listener executes as the space is being created, meaning when you click on this button on the right to create a new space, or if you embed Flatfile in your web app, a new space will be created each time a user clicks on the Import button. In my case, I've already created a space and we can see it here. If we look at the code, you'll see that the first thing I'm doing is get the information I need from the events context to run the code below, and then before I create anything, I first acknowledge the job. I'll go into specifics about it later, but unless you're working with a Flatfile native job that is responsible for imported data processing, you always want to acknowledge the job first. The reason you want to do this is, in my case, I'm just creating one workbook with a couple of sheets and a Submit button. That is pretty simple. But if your use case calls for creating many workbooks or many sheets as the space is being created, acknowledging the job first ensures that the space creation does not time out and a space gets created properly. So after we acknowledge the job, I make an API call to create a workbook with the name workbook1, as we can see over here, and I'm attaching two sheets to it that are inside of my workbook1 variable. Now I have that variable defined in a separate file, and if we take a look at it real quick, it is just two sheet configs, one called contacts with fields associated with it, and then the second one called companies. I pass both sheets into the workbook1 variable, and then I export it to my index.ts and reference it here. So once the workbook and sheets get created, last but not least, I'm also creating a workbook level submit action in order for users to be able to submit the data to you. Once the workbook, the two sheets, and the submit button are created, I either complete the job if everything goes well, and if something goes wrong, we fail a job with a specific message. So that's all that the first listener does, is when a user creates a space, we tell Flatfile what to include as part of that space. The second listener executes when Flatfile is done processing the mapping job. So that means is when a user imports a file to Flatfile and that file is done extracting, they're taken to the mapping step. That is where they decide which columns to map and which not to map, and after that, they're ready to click this Continue button. So when they click the Continue button, the mapping job starts, and once the table loads with all the fields from your sheet and with all the data from the file, that mapping job completes. So when the user clicks this Continue button and that mapping job completes, the following code is executed. In it, you will see that all we're doing is creating a custom job and nothing else. And as I mentioned before in the first listener, it was important to acknowledge the job before we executed any code. In here, you will notice that I'm not acknowledging completing or failing any job. I'm just including my code to create a custom job. The reason is workbook map job is a Flatfile native job that is responsible for important data processing. It takes into the account the fields that the user wants to map, updates the table with all the fields that are in your sheet, and then populates those fields with the data that a user imported. That native job is responsible for important data processing, so we do not want to intervene with it. Under the hood, Flatfile team has already decided how this job has to be acknowledged, how it has to be completed, and if something goes wrong, how it should be failed. Therefore, we want to intrude as little as possible in this job. That is why over here, all I'm doing is creating a custom job. I'm running it on a workbook, and I'm giving it operation name view mapped fields only. Note that later in the third listener, that is exactly the job that we're going to be executing. Trigger immediate over here ensures that once the mapping job is complete and the custom job is ready to be ran, it will be ran automatically. We're making that job foreground, which is responsible for showing that pop-up model to the user that the table has been updated and the user is ready to audit the data before submitting it. And last but not least, what you will also notice is I am saving the job ID of the mapping job inside here, inside of the mapping job ID variable. We are going to access it in the third listener. That is why over here we're saving it when that job is created. So that is all that the second listener does. It creates a custom job. So when we click on this continue button, the mapping job begins, and when the mapping job completes, we get the following pop-up. As you will notice over here, I am creating it only when the job is complete. So this is how the final UI looks like. The Flatfile table is updated only with mapped fields. So let's take a look at the third listener so we can understand the logic that is happening to update that table to only show mapped fields. So the third listener executes immediately after the workbook map job is complete and our custom job is created. So let's take a look at the code. Because this is a custom job and it is not a Flatfile native job, we again acknowledge the job before we carry out any code to make sure that it doesn't time out, especially in cases where there is a heavy code logic going on. After we acknowledge the job, the first thing we do is we fetch the general information about our custom job. And once that is done, we can access that general information to get the mapping job ID out of it. So not the job ID of our custom job, but a job ID of the mapping job when our custom job was created. We need that information in order to obtain an execution plan for the mapping job. The reason why we want the execution plan is because it will contain the information on the fields that a user mapped and on the fields that a user did not map during the mapping stage. So once we have that information, we can create an empty mapping fields array and then loop over the execution plan to only retrieve the keys of the fields that a user mapped. Once we have that, we push up those keys up to the mapped fields array here. So now it contains the information on the keys of the fields that a user mapped. Now that we have that, we can loop over our workbook1 workbook. We can access each sheet in it, and we can access the fields as well. And for the fields that were mapped, for those that are inside of that variable, we update their metadata with mapped equals true. After that, what we do is we loop over each sheet again, and we filter only to have the fields that were mapped. So when we look inside of the filtered workbook fields variable, it will contain a workbook, 2 sheets, and only those fields that were mapped. It will no longer contain the fields that were not mapped. The last 2 things that are left for us to do are first, to make an API call to fetch our original workbook. If you console log out that workbook, it will still contain all the information about all the fields, and it will not have the metadata mapped equals true. But we do need to make that API call in order to update the workbook, because we need it in a specific format. So now that we've fetched that workbook, we're ready to update it. And when we're done updating the workbook, that is actually when the Flatfile table updates to only show the user the mapped fields. So let's take a look at what we're doing. We make an API call to update the workbook, and we preserve its original general information, such as the name of the workbook. But when it comes to the fields specifically, we're updating that workbook to only include the mapped fields and nothing else. So that way, after the workbook is done updating, it returns all the sheets that are a part of it, so the two contacts and companies sheets, and it will only return the fields information for those that were mapped. Once the workbook is successfully updated, we complete a job with a specific message to the user that table update complete, please audit the data. And that is exactly the same information that is presented to the user here. And then in case something goes wrong while our custom job executes, we fail that job with a specific message. So once that custom job is done executing, the success message is presented to the user as a pop-up model. They're ready to click continue button, audit the data before they click the submit button. Once they click the submit button, the code in our last listener will execute. Inside of it, the first thing we do is fetch the necessary information out of the event context so that the code below executes. And then before we do anything else, we first acknowledge the job. Again, the submit action is a custom action, a custom job that we created. It is not a Flatfile native job. Therefore, before we do anything, we want to acknowledge that job first. Once it is acknowledged, we first fetch all the sheets out of our workbook, and then we declare an empty records object. That object will store the records that are a part of the mapped fields that a user is trying to submit. So using this for loop, we look at all the fields and we make sure that for the fields that have mapped equals true metadata, we push up the records back to our records object here. Now you might be wondering, why am I doing this if statement over here to check if a field has mapped equals true metadata, if in the previous listener we updated our workbook to only contain such fields? The reason I'm doing this here is to show you the bonus content. In other words, how you can protect your database against accidentally receiving duplicate information if a user clicks on the submit button twice. That is why that if statement is here, and I will show you why it is important in just a little bit. Once we loop over the fields with mapped equals true metadata, and we push the records up to the records object here, we're now ready to send over the data to our sample database. In my case, it is a webhook receiver that I declared at the beginning of the code. It is just a unique URL that sends the data to the webhook. It will contain the records in that records object, and once the submit action is complete, I will get that data. So let's see how it looks like. I'll click on the submit button here. The job will run, and I will be notified that it has completed successfully and I'm ready to check the data. When I go to my sample database, I can indeed see that I received the data about the mapped fields, and I have the values for those fields. Perfect. Let's take a look at the rest of the code to see what am I doing as this submit action is getting carried out. Once the data is sent, for one last time, I'm fetching my workbook, and then I'm updating that workbook. The reason I am updating the workbook is because now that the data has been sent over to my database, I want to go ahead and delete mapped equals true metadata from the fields that have it. Once that update is done, the workbook will no longer contain fields with mapped equals true metadata. And that is precisely why when users click on the submit button again, the job will complete, but that if statement will no longer be satisfied because there are no longer fields with such metadata, so there are no records that are getting pushed up to the records object here. And therefore, when the Axios post call is executed again, this records object is empty. If we check the response again on the second submit, it contains no data. So that is why that if statement there is important, and that is why we update our workbook as the submit action is getting carried out to delete the metadata mapped equals true. We return all the information about the workbook, and we make sure that the fields are only those that have mapped equals true metadata deleted. And last but not least, we complete a job if everything executes correctly, and then if something goes wrong in the process, we fail a job with a specific message. This is it for my second video. Thank you so much for watching it, especially if you watched the entire video. I know it was a lot of information, and as I mentioned during the video, I will include the public GitHub repository and all the relevant Flatfile documentation in the description of this video. I will be releasing new videos each month, so if you can, please subscribe, leave a like on the video, and if you have any feedback or any requests for the future content, please leave those in the comment section and I will make sure to consider it. Thank you again and have a good day.